Before we talk about area scaling factor and how to adjust it in SpectroFlo, there are a few things we need to understand. One is you need to understand the height of the laser beam on your system and how that relates to the size of the particles that you're running on your flow cytometer. On the Cytek Aurora and Northern Lights, the beam height on average is around 5 microns. The SpectroFlo QC bead that you run for daily QC is approximately 3 microns, so slightly smaller than the beam height. If you were to attach a telescope onto your cytometer and look down into the flow cell, this is what you'd see. The picture here is an image from a 3-laser Cytek Aurora. You can see there is a violet laser beam, a blue laser beam, and a red laser beam. The bright white spots that you're seeing in the middle are QC beads lighting up as they pass through the laser beam. So if you can imagine, you're sitting at the cytometer with your tube of QC beads loaded, and your sample is flowing up into the system, as shown here. In this picture, you can see the sides of the cuvette in the flow cell as they are lit up from all the laser light up there. Here again, shown by the arrow, is a 3 micron QC bead that is emitting light after being excited by the violet laser. The larger circle around the bead is the head of the fiber optic cable, which is carrying that emitted light from the bead created by the violet laser's excitation of that bead, and that light is taken to the violet laser APD module. If you'd like to learn more about that process, check out our YouTube video, Cytek Aurora Product Overview. Now, I have this little cartoon showing what happens as the QC bead moves through the flow cell. I took this little image and enlarged it here. The white edges here are representing my cuvette walls, and the direction of the flow is from the bottom to the top. There are 3 different laser beams, the violet, blue, and red lasers. Here is my QC bead, represented by this white circle. Over here on the right is a plot showing what's happening in the electronics as the bead moves through the flow cell. So you're looking at the plot rotated 90 degrees from what you're used to seeing, simply so I can align it with what's happening to the signal with the movement of the bead as it passes through each of these 3 laser beams. On the y-axis, I'm showing signal, or the emitted light that's being captured, which is being converted to a voltage on the electronics side. On the x-axis, I'm showing everything occurring over time. It takes some time for this bead to move through the flow cell and pass through each of these beam paths. So, as the QC bead is outside of the beam at this point, there's little to no signal being detected. There might be some low-level electronic noise in the system, so it's not exactly 0. Then, as we start moving through the laser beam, now we are starting to capture a signal, and that signal increases as more and more of that bead enters into the beam. Now we're about halfway through and fully immersed in the beam, so this will be the maximum amount of signal detected from the emitted light of this particular bead. As the bead starts moving out of the laser beam, you'll see that signal decrease, and when the bead is completely out of the beam, we're back down where we started. So let's take a look at that signal we generated by rotating the plot 90 degrees so it is easier to read. Now, when you're on your flow cytometer, the electronic signal can be presented in a couple different ways in your cytometer software. One is to take the height of that signal, shown by the yellow arrow here. And when you're playing in your cytometer software, this could be something like BV421-H that you're used to looking at in the parameter list. More often than not, people are used to looking at the signal in terms of area. The area is this cumulative signal underneath this triangular signal cartoon that I've sketched out, and that's what appears in the software as the MFI intensity for something like BV421-A in your cytometer software plots. The goal of the area scaling factor is to have the signal intensity of this area signal be similar to that of the height signal. So, for the small SpectroFlo QC bead that is 3 microns, slightly smaller than the laser beam height on the Aurora or Northern Lights cytometers, often the area scaling factor is going to be close to 1, or a little more than 1, since the bead is slightly smaller than the beam height on average. To show you an example of this, I've pulled a screenshot of a QC report from a 5-laser Cytek Aurora, which you can locate by going into SpectroFlo Software's QC and Setup module, clicking on Cytometer QC, and then going to the Reports tab. If you scroll down in the QC report, you'll see all 5 lasers and the area scaling factors that are automatically calculated when you run daily QC. You'll see most of them are a little above 1 for that 3 micron QC bead. Now the question is, do these area scaling factors work for all sample types? And the answer is no. Odds are, if you're running cells that are much larger than these 3-micron beads, especially if you're getting to sizes around 10 to 20 microns, you're going to want to adjust these area scaling factors, as the one generated by daily QC is not ideal for these cell samples. To show you what happens with that same cartoon, let's take a look at a big cell moving through the flow cell. Right now, we are about to move through the violet laser beam, so again, no signal yet other than electronic noise. Then this giant cell starts passing through the laser beam, and the signal starts increasing. The cell keeps flowing along, and now you can see that the cell is fully immersed in the beam, so the signal is maximized. There's no more signal that can occur, there is no more beam that the cell can fill. It's going to take a little time before this large cell starts exiting the beam path. So, while this cell is filling the entire beam, the signal will flatten off for a while. Once the cell starts moving out of the beam, the signal will start decreasing, and when the cell is completely outside of the beam, the signal is back where it started. So again, let's take a look at this plotted signal rotated 90 degrees so it's easier to read. Again, you can measure the height of this signal to display something like BV421-H on your cytometer. But the area signal is now quite large, since that large cell fully filled the laser beam for some time as it passed through. You can imagine for a large cell, the area signal is going to be much larger than the height signal, compared to what we saw for that small QC bead. So, to get that area signal to have a similar MFI in our dot plots, compared to the height signal, I need to decrease the area scaling factors, likely to values much less than 1, in order to get these two parameters in a similar ballpark. No matter what kind of sample you plan to run, remember to check these values before acquiring your precious samples. It's best to optimize the area scaling factors for the cells you are working with in your assays, especially if they are very large cells, say 10 to 20 microns. The ASFs generated by daily QC are a great starting point, and if you're working with something like whole blood, odds are the QC ASFs are good enough. It's not perfect. You could spend time optimizing it if you so choose, but at least your signals will likely be on scale. When you're working with larger cells, since that area signal is so much larger, you may encounter your signals are going off scale, and I'll show you how to deal with that now inside SpectroFlo. Inside SpectroFlo, I'm going to go ahead and open a default experiment. Let me clean up these plots a little bit here. And I'm going to shrink my P1 gate a little. Next, I'm going to take some untransfected mouse epithelial cells that I have and load those onto my cytometer. I'll run these at low flow rate, and I'm going to start with Cytek assay setting. As you can see, this setting currently has area scaling factors automatically determined based on the QC beads. Let me also change my scatter gains, as the defaults here are a bit high for these particular cells, and I'll also increase my threshold a bit to cut out more debris. I'm also going to enable the height parameter so I can show you the difference between the area and height MFIs as I adjust the ASFs in the Lasers tab. So let me click Start, and we'll wait for the cells to appear. Okay, I'm going to decrease my forward scatter gain a little more and click Restart to refresh the plots. One of the first things you might notice is I have two plots here. This first one I have forward scatter area versus side scatter area. Immediately next to it, I have forward scatter height and side scatter height. You can see on the height plot, the MFI for the cells is much lower than the MFI of these cells on the area plot, which is what we would expect based on our earlier discussion in the PowerPoint slides. So first, I'm going to optimize my forward scatter and side scatter so that these area and height MFIs are similar. You can do this visually until these two plots look similar, or if you want, you could make a side scatter height versus side scatter area plot and a forward scatter height versus forward scatter area plot, like this example here, and adjust the area scaling factors until you get a diagonal line down the center. To be very accurate, you could make a gate on the cells and create a stats table displaying MFI for forward scatter and side scatter, area and height, and adjust the ASFs until the area and height numbers are close too. Okay, so maybe I'll name this gate scatter height. I'll quickly adjust my P1 gate around my cells too. Then I'll make a stats table real quick. Let me make this window a little bigger and disable all these pre-checked boxes. I'll add both P1 and scatter height to my table, and I want to look at medians for forward and side scatter, area, and height. I'm going to hold the Shift key so I can multi-select some options here. Add statistics. I accidentally checked count, so let me go ahead and remove that. And then I'll save this table. Okay, so now you can see quantitatively that the forward scatter area MFI for these cells is much larger than the forward scatter height MFI, and same story for side scatter area and height. So first, let's adjust the forward scatter area scaling factor by decreasing it. Then I'll click Restart to refresh the plots. You'll need to keep adjusting this gate here, as the visualization on the area plot will keep changing as the ASF is adjusted. However, on the height plot, everything will remain the same. If I look at the scatter height gate in my stats table, I have forward scatter area around 1.5 million and forward scatter height around 1.2. So I can decrease my forward scatter ASF more. Now I'm at 1.4 and 1.2, so I'll decrease a little further. Now it looks like 1.2 and just under 1.2, so now things are pretty close. After that adjustment, I'm going to go back to my forward scatter gain and increase it a bit so I can see my cells further up on my plot. Now let's take care of the side scatter area scaling factor. Since side scatter is off of the violet laser, I'll adjust the violet ASF, which is currently at 1.11. I'm going to set it to 0.8 and click Restart to refresh my data. Let me go ahead and adjust my scatter height gate and take a look at the stats. I'm at roughly 1.5 million for side scatter area and 1.1 million for side scatter height. So let's decrease further to say 0.6. And I'll click Restart. Let's look at the stats again. Now I'm at 1.1 and just under 1.1. So now things are pretty close. I'm going to go ahead and record a few of these just so I can have them as a reference. Again, these are my untransfected mouse epithelial cells. Also, let me change the flow rate so the acquisition will go a little faster. I'll click the pause button to stop the recording. Then the flow rate toggle will become active, and I can increase that. Then we wait for the flow to start again, and I'll click record to continue recording. Okay, I've got a couple thousand events saved now, so I'm going to go ahead and stop recording this tube. The next tube I'm going to load are the same cells, except they've been transfected with a fluorescent protein. So what I'm going to look at is first, where is this protein fluorescing, and then adjust the area scaling factors for the laser lines generating fluorescent signals to match the area and height MFIs. So let me go ahead and duplicate this tube, and I'll label this one FP cells for fluorescent protein cells. And then I'll click Start. Let's see where this fluorescent protein lights up on our system. Okay, the protein in these cells is largely detected in some of the blue laser detectors, which you can see on the spectral plot here that's based off of our P1 gate. If I scroll down in this default raw worksheet, I can see the signal on these blue histograms too. One thing you'll notice is that some of these cells are quite bright and are actually off scale. One way to address this is to adjust our Cytek assay setting gains. However, since we know these cells are large and the ASF needs some adjustment, I recommend that you optimize the area scaling factor first, and then if further adjustment is still needed, we can go revisit the Cytek assay setting gains. So let's go on and adjust those ASFs. Looking at the blue laser, I'm going to decrease it to 0.6 and click Restart. I'm also going to change my flow rate to low again, so I don't use up my sample too quickly. Okay, and with that one adjustment, you can see now that my signals are nicely on scale. So for this particular cell line and sample, I don't need any further adjustment to my gains. Simply adjusting the area scaling factor was sufficient to bring my signals on scale. Now let's take a look at the MFI data. I'm going to return to the stats table, right-click, and select Edit. And I'm going to add a few more channels here, one off of each laser line. I'll select Median, and again I'll hold the Control key so I can multi-select a few different channels. Okay, so I added all of the area MFIs to the table for the third channel off of each laser. Now let me go back and add the height MFIs. Okay, now let's take a look. If I compare B3 area with B3 height for the P1 gate, it looks like B3 area is slightly higher, just over 8K, compared to B3 height, which is around 7K. So I could further decrease my blue area scaling factor to match these values better. Let's try something like 0.58 and click Restart to refresh the data. Now I'm seeing around 8.1K for B3 area and 7.4K for B3 height. So let's go lower still. Let's try 0.5 and click Restart to refresh the data. Okay, now B3 area is around 6.9K compared to 7.3K for height, so I went a little too far. Let's go and increase that area scaling factor a little and try again. Now I'm at 7.6 for area and around 7.3, 7.4 for height, so they're pretty close. I could do similar adjustments for the violet, yellow, green, red, and UV area scaling factors too. They'll likely be similar to the adjustment I just made for the blue laser area scaling factor, around 0.6. In reality, there will be slight differences. Since my sample, however, only has a protein fluorescing in the blue channels, I probably won't be able to discern these differences without having samples that have a fluorescent protein or other fluorochromes excited by each of these other lasers. So ideally, I would go through and look at the same sample, stained with a yellow-green fluorochrome, such as PE, to optimize the yellow-green area scaling factor, and another sample stained with something like APC to optimize the red area scaling factor, and so on and so forth for the UV and violet area scaling factors. Once you have all your area scaling factors determined, you need to save your setting. Give the setting a name, optimized large cell setting, and click Save so I can reuse this setting for future experiments. One thing you'll want to do after you're finished establishing your ASFs is to disable the height signal from your setting. The reason for this is once you've optimized your area scaling factors, you're really only going to look at your area data going forward. With all the fluorescence height parameters enabled, your FCS file will be almost double in size compared to an FCS file that was generated with only the fluorescence area parameters enabled. I need to stop my sample in order to make these adjustments to those height parameters. Then I can uncheck the height boxes and save my setting. If after making these area scaling factor changes, your signals are still off scale, then I would go back and start adjusting the Cytek assay setting gains. You can find more details on how to do that in our Cytek assay setting video.